Taylor Swift faces humiliation in first class, but when her friend Travis Kelce steps in, everything changes. What happens next will leave you speechless. The exclusive first-class lounge at LAX was alive with the sounds of chatter, clinking glasses, and the rhythmic hum of rolling luggage as passengers awaited their flights. The atmosphere was vibrant, yet calm, a luxury oasis amidst the chaos of the airport terminal. Soft lighting bathed the room, accentuating the plush seating, sleek marble floors, and sleek contemporary decor that gave the space an air of sophistication and ease. Around the room, passengers were either deep in conversation or absorbed in their devices, some leisurely sipping on champagne or cocktails, while others typed away on their laptops, preparing for the upcoming flight. The low buzz of conversation blended with the occasional ring of a phone or the soft clink of a drink being set down, creating a sense of effortless luxury. In the corner of the lounge, far removed from the hustle and bustle, sat Taylor Swift. Dressed simply in a large oversized sweater, jeans, and her go-to white sneakers, she blended into the atmosphere effortlessly. Her trademark curls cascaded over her shoulders, and her soft, natural beauty was accentuated by the lack of makeup. A worn paperback book rested in her hands, the edges slightly curled from previous readings. The world-famous pop star seemed as though she had no intention of drawing attention to herself. Her presence was almost unassuming. For someone whose face graced the covers of magazines and whose songs were heard in every corner of the world, Taylor Swift appeared remarkably unbothered by the celebrity status she carried. She was content in her corner, fully immersed in the quiet world of her book, leaving behind the dazzling spotlight that followed her everywhere. In that moment, she was just another traveler, enjoying the calm before the whirlwind of her next destination. But unbeknownst to her, her peaceful corner was about to be shattered by the arrival of another passenger, a woman who had a much different approach to status and luxury. Margaret Winchester entered the first-class lounge with a grand entrance, her every step exuding an air of dominance. Dressed in the finest designer clothes, her attire screamed wealth and exclusivity. A flowing, luxurious fur stole draped over her shoulders, and her diamonds, sparkling in the soft lounge light, seemed to outshine everything around her. Each piece of jewelry on her person seemed to tell a story of her impeccable taste and deep pockets. She was a woman who had mastered the art of being noticed, and she made no effort to conceal the satisfaction she found in this constant attention. As she settled into her plush seat, she scanned the room with a quick, assessing gaze. Her eyes finally landed on Taylor Swift, who, in stark contrast, sat calmly in her simple oversized sweater, sneakers, and a pair of jeans. Her modest, understated outfit barely aligned with the image of the glamorous, jet-setting celebrity that Margaret expected. In that moment, an eyebrow arched and a small, judgmental smile curled on Margaret's lips. The woman could not help but make a quiet comment to her companion, though loud enough for those sitting nearby to catch a glimpse of her opinion. "Can you believe what they're letting into first class these days?" Margaret murmured, her voice dripping with condescension, but just soft enough to not be an outright public accusation. She paused, clearly aiming to provoke. "I remember when this lounge had real standards, but now, well, I suppose they just let anyone in. It's like they don't care about the image anymore." Her companion, Sarah, glanced toward the young woman, unsure how to respond, but Margaret seemed eager to escalate. She leaned further in, pointedly eyeing Taylor's comfortable sneakers and simple sweater as she spoke again, this time louder, for those near enough to overhear. "I mean, look at her," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly with obvious disdain. "A superstar like her shouldn't be wearing sneakers and that sweater. She's in first class, but she doesn't look the part, does she? One would expect a little more sophistication when you're at this level." Taylor, who had heard whispers and criticisms like this before, didn't flinch. Her eyes remained focused on her book, the calmness in her demeanor completely unshaken by Margaret's obvious attempt to provoke. But as Margaret continued, the discomfort in the air became palpable. Her comments weren't just a critique, they were an outright attempt to belittle Taylor, to create a sense of social hierarchy in the midst of the lounge's already privileged space. Margaret's voice continued, increasingly louder and more insistent, trying to force her wealth and privilege into Taylor's face. She clearly expected Taylor to be rattled, to be self-conscious, or perhaps even apologize for not meeting her so-called standards. It was clear she believed her money and status were more than enough to make anyone feel inferior, especially someone she deemed unworthy of first-class status. As Margaret's attempts grew bolder, Taylor remained composed, unaffected by the glaring words intended to belittle her. Margaret's superiority was, to her, a sign of class and refinement, but little did she know, Taylor's true class came not from what she wore, but from how she carried herself, quietly, confidently, and without the need for validation from anyone. As Margaret's words echoed through the first-class lounge, Taylor remained unflinching. Her eyes never left the pages of her book, her fingers delicately turning the page with the same calmness she had shown when she first sat down. Each gesture was slow and deliberate, like a quiet defiance in the face of Margaret's attempts to provoke her. Taylor's silence spoke volumes. She wasn't interested in engaging with someone who had so clearly made her judgment without understanding the full story. For those who were paying attention, it was becoming evident that Margaret's sharp remarks were falling on deaf ears. While she waited for some reaction, perhaps a flustered apology or an uncomfortable glance, Taylor's composure only grew stronger. She wasn't rattled. Her unshakable calmness became a subtle yet powerful act of resilience, like a quiet storm that silently swept away the words intended to hurt her. As the seconds stretched into minutes, a few passengers nearby began to shift in their seats. They exchanged glances, sensing the building tension between the two women. Some, intrigued by the unusual dynamic, glanced nervously at each other, unsure whether to step in or simply observe. Others pretended to be absorbed in their phones, trying to avoid becoming involved in what seemed to be a brewing storm. Margaret, not used to being ignored, continued her tirade, speaking louder now, perhaps trying to provoke some sort of response. But each of her words seemed to ricochet off Taylor's calm, unaffected demeanor. It was as if she were speaking into the wind, her attempts at confrontation only serving to highlight the contrast between her impatience and Taylor's serene nature. In the midst of this, Taylor remained focused, her demeanor unbothered and unaffected. She wasn't going to entertain Margaret's petty game. Instead, she chose to take the high road, showing not just physical restraint but a deeper emotional control. She refused to let someone else's superficiality disturb her inner peace. And in doing so, she became a silent lesson to the entire lounge, a lesson in dignity, self-respect, and the quiet power of not engaging in unnecessary drama. By now, the subtle hum of the lounge had turned into whispers, as the other passengers began to murmur among themselves. They were witnessing an interaction that was quietly, but powerfully, unfolding right in front of them. Would Taylor respond? Would Margaret get the reaction she was craving? The tension lingered in the air, the calm before a storm, as the passengers waited for something, anything, to happen. They were caught in the middle of a silent battle of wills, one that didn't require words to be powerful. The door to the first-class lounge swung open with a soft creak, momentarily cutting through the tension in the air. Everyone's attention, momentarily diverted, turned toward the new arrival. There he stood, Travis Kelce, the towering star NFL player, known not only for his skills on the field but also for his effortless charm and magnetic presence. Dressed casually in a fitted jacket and dark jeans, Travis seemed perfectly at ease, his broad shoulders and confident stride catching the eyes of everyone in the room. His eyes scanned the space as he entered, but it didn't take long for his gaze to land on Taylor. A smile slowly spread across his face as he made his way toward her, the warmth of recognition evident in his eyes. There was no hesitation in his steps, no doubt in his demeanor. As he moved through the lounge, the air seemed to shift, the tension around Margaret's cruel comments now fading into the background. Margaret, still basking in the belief that her words held weight, didn't immediately register the significance of the man entering. She was still too focused on maintaining her carefully constructed sense of superiority, attempting to keep her cool despite her earlier discomfort with Taylor's calm response. But as Travis made his way toward Taylor, Margaret's eyes followed him, first curiously, then in recognition. Her perfectly crafted facade faltered, the realization hitting her like a cold wave. This wasn't just any man walking toward Taylor, this was Travis Kelce, one of the most well-known and respected figures in sports, a man whose name was synonymous with talent, charisma, and success. As the pieces clicked in her mind, she tried to maintain her composure, but the unease was visible in her eyes. Her previous attempts at asserting dominance suddenly seemed trivial, reduced to the background noise of the room as Travis approached. Taylor looked up from her book, her expression softening at the sight of her friend. "Travis," she exclaimed warmly, a bright smile lighting up her face. She stood as he reached her, and without hesitation, they shared a brief, friendly hug. Travis leaned in to whisper something into her ear, and they both shared a quiet laugh, the kind of genuine, carefree moment between two people who had known each other for years. The lounge around them seemed to pause, the atmosphere shifting in an instant from tension to ease. Margaret, still trying to hold on to her sense of control, watched in disbelief as Travis and Taylor interacted. There was something about their effortless familiarity that highlighted just how far removed she was from this kind of genuine connection. The more she watched, the more rattled she became. Her earlier attempts to belittle Taylor's humble attire and demeanor seemed to hang in the air, increasingly out of place in the presence of Travis, who had just effortlessly entered the scene, commanding the respect of everyone around him with nothing more than a smile and his warm, welcoming energy. Travis's presence was commanding, not because of his fame or his stature, but because of the way he carried himself, his ease, his kindness, and his respect for those around him. Margaret's gaze shifted between Taylor and Travis, her own carefully constructed world suddenly crumbling. It was clear now, she was no longer the center of attention. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and there was nothing she could do to reclaim it. As Travis continued his conversation with Taylor, laughing and sharing an inside joke, it was evident that Margaret's attempts to establish her own superiority had failed. She had tried to critique Taylor's attire, her presence, even her place in first class, but in the face of genuine friendship and humility, her words lost their power. Travis didn't just elevate Taylor's presence in the room, he reminded everyone that true worth wasn't defined by clothes, labels, or perceived status, it was about how we treated one another. In that moment, Margaret's attempted dominance over Taylor seemed small and petty. She had tried to tear someone down in an effort to make herself feel superior, but in the presence of genuine kindness, humility, and respect, her words became meaningless. The true power of the moment wasn't in what Margaret had said or how she looked, it was in the way Taylor and Travis carried themselves, in the unspoken message that genuine success and class come not from wealth or appearance but from integrity and the way we treat others. As the conversation between Taylor and Travis unfolded, Margaret, oblivious to the subtle shift in the room, continued to dig herself deeper into the hole of passive-aggressive remarks. She aimed her words at Taylor, thinking she could still assert dominance over the situation, not realizing that her behavior was starting to make everyone around her uncomfortable. The passengers seated nearby were no longer pretending to mind their own business, their eyes occasionally flicked toward the exchange, some shaking their heads at Margaret's persistent snubs. Margaret, unaware of the growing discomfort in the room, turned her attention back to Taylor. "It's just surprising," she said, her voice tinged with mock curiosity, "to see someone in first class who doesn't seem to appreciate the luxury of it all. I mean, we all work hard to get here, don't we? But some people just don't seem to care about maintaining a certain level of standards." The words were sharp, intentionally so, and as they hung in the air, Margaret clearly felt her superiority rise again. She had tried to make her point earlier with veiled insults, but now, she was going all in. However, as Margaret continued, she didn't notice Travis moving toward the scene. He had been seated a few rows away and had overheard the entirety of Margaret's remarks. As he made his way toward Taylor, he caught the full weight of Margaret's condescending tone. His calm, confident stride brought him directly between the two women, his presence immediately capturing the attention of everyone in the cabin. Margaret, caught up in her own sense of entitlement, didn't recognize the gravity of the situation until she saw Travis approach. She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, but she still tried to hold on to her composed facade. "Oh, Mr. Kelce," she said with a hint of forced sweetness, "I didn't realize you were part of this interesting group." Travis, unfazed by her attempt to pull him into the conversation, turned to face her directly. His voice, although calm and measured, carried an undeniable authority that quieted the lounge around them. "You know," he began, his tone even but firm, "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about standards. And while I do get where you're coming from, I think you might have missed something." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, unsure of where this was going. She had just insulted Taylor, no one was supposed to challenge her here, not in this space. But Travis didn't flinch. He continued with the same quiet confidence that had made him a star. "True class," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the lounge, "has nothing to do with labels or fancy clothes. It's about how you treat others, no matter who they are or what they're wearing. I've known Taylor for years. And believe me, she doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." The words hung in the air like a quiet challenge, aimed directly at Margaret. The smug expression that had been plastered on her face slowly began to falter. Her attempt to maintain control over the conversation, her need to establish herself as the dominant figure, was slipping away. As Travis's words sunk in, her expression shifted from defiance to uncertainty. It was clear she hadn't expected this kind of response, especially not from someone like Travis Kelce. For a moment, Margaret's mask of superiority cracked, her earlier bravado now replaced by a palpable discomfort. She was forced to face the reality of her actions and the disrespect she had shown, not just to Taylor but to everyone in the cabin who had been witness to her attempts to belittle another person. The stark contrast between her behavior and the warmth and respect shown by Taylor and Travis was too much to ignore. Margaret, now fully aware of the gravity of her actions, fumbled for the right words. I didn't mean," she began, but her voice trailed off, unable to finish her sentence. Her carefully crafted arrogance evaporated in front of everyone, leaving her standing there, trying to find a way to save face. Taylor, ever gracious, offered a gentle smile. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice kind. "We all have our moments. What matters is learning from them." Travis, who had remained composed throughout, nodded in agreement. "Exactly," he added. "We're all here to enjoy the journey, not to tear each other down." The realization hit Margaret like a ton of bricks. She had been so focused on maintaining her image, on putting others down to elevate herself, that she hadn't recognized what true class really looked like. It wasn't in the designer clothes or the price tag on the tickets, it was in the way people treated others, regardless of status. Margaret took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as the weight of the situation finally settled in. She had to apologize. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." The sincerity in her apology wasn't lost on anyone. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a newfound sense of respect. The once proud and dismissive woman had been humbled, and the lesson had been learned, not just by her, but by everyone around her. As the flight continued, Margaret's discomfort remained, but it was clear that she had learned something valuable. She had been given a rare opportunity to see what true class looked like, and it wasn't something that could be bought. It was something far more powerful, the ability to be kind, to show respect, and to value others not for what they had, but for who they were. Travis and Taylor, meanwhile, resumed their quiet conversation, their effortless connection a stark contrast to the tension that had just passed. The passengers around them, who had witnessed the entire exchange, seemed to relax, as if they too had learned something from the encounter. The lesson was clear: class isn't about appearances or material wealth, it's about the way you treat people, no matter who they are. As the flight continued its journey, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Margaret, once loud and condescending, now sat in quiet reflection. Her earlier arrogance had dissolved, replaced by a deep sense of humility that weighed heavily on her. The contrast was stark. Where once she had been trying to assert her superiority, now she was lost in thought, her eyes cast downward as she clutched her Louis Vuitton bag tightly, as if it had somehow become a symbol of everything she now regretted. In stark contrast, Taylor and Travis remained the same, calm, friendly, and gracious. As they continued their conversations, they interacted warmly with the flight attendants and fellow passengers, signing autographs, posing for pictures, and offering words of encouragement. Their genuine kindness had nothing to do with their celebrity status, it was simply who they were, and it was evident to everyone around them. The passengers, who had witnessed the tension unfold earlier, were now murmuring among themselves. Conversations turned to the lesson that had been taught in that brief moment of discomfort. A few passengers, especially the flight attendants, spoke softly, reflecting on the incident and what it had taught them. One stewardess, who had watched the entire exchange with growing awareness, turned to another colleague and said, "It's not about how much money you spend or what brands you wear. It's about how you carry yourself, and the way you treat others, no matter who they are or where they come from." Other passengers joined in, nodding in agreement, as the impact of the encounter sunk in. A shift in understanding spread throughout the cabin. True class wasn't about material possessions, expensive clothes, or designer handbags. It was about the respect you showed to people, regardless of their status. It was about humility and kindness, qualities that money couldn't buy. Margaret, deep in thought, couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her behavior had been misplaced. She had been so focused on outward appearances, on trying to fit into a mold of wealth and status, that she had forgotten what really mattered. Her mind replayed the moments of her condescending remarks, her words coming across as harsh and unnecessary. She felt the sting of regret now, realizing that she had been blinded by her own arrogance. With a deep breath, she finally stood up, smoothing out her designer scarf as she made her way to Taylor and Travis. Her footsteps were hesitant at first, but as she drew closer, her resolve grew. She had to do this. She had to acknowledge her mistake and offer the apology that had been long overdue. Reaching their row, she paused for a moment, taking in the genuine warmth of Taylor and Travis, who were both engaged in conversation with a couple of other passengers. They didn't look at her with disdain, but with quiet understanding, as if they already knew what was coming. Margaret cleared her throat and took a deep breath. "Excuse me, Taylor, Travis," she began, her voice quieter than usual, a far cry from the confident tone she had used earlier. "I just wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. I've been acting terribly, and I realize now how wrong I was to judge you or anyone based on appearances. I let my own pride get in the way of seeing the bigger picture." Taylor looked up at her, offering a soft smile, her eyes warm with understanding. "It's okay," she said kindly. "We all have moments where we make mistakes. What matters is that you recognize it and learn from it. That's what counts." Travis, too, nodded, his expression calm but firm. "We all have a responsibility to be better to each other, no matter what. It's easy to get caught up in appearances, but true success is about how you make others feel." Margaret swallowed, the weight of their words sinking in deeper. The warmth of their response, their genuine forgiveness, made her feel even more humbled. She had expected some sort of cold reception, maybe even a harsh word, but instead, she found kindness and understanding. As the flight continued, Margaret sat back in her seat, a quiet reflection taking over her. The earlier tension had melted away, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude for the lesson she had just learned. It wasn't the kind of lesson she had expected to receive today, but it was the kind she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about labels, and it wasn't about being first class. It was about humanity, humility, and respect. The plane began its descent as passengers started to prepare for landing. Margaret, no longer concerned with what others thought of her, smiled softly to herself. The lesson of the flight had etched itself into her heart. As the seatbelt signs illuminated, she looked out the window, knowing that she had learned something far more valuable than any designer label. She had learned what it truly meant to be a person of character, someone who didn't just measure success by what she had, but by how she treated others.